it's like a cleaning service. When you cause a mess by emitting greenhouse gases and you contribute to the climate crisis in a negative way, this is a way to try to counterbalance that negative impact that especially companies, but why not individual consumers as well, have.
Welcome to the Urbanista, where we discuss the water management challenges of Nordic cities. From safe drinking water distribution and stormwater collection to building sustainable urban living environments. Here is your host, Delphine Vesalo.
Hey, welcome back, Urbanistas. The other day, I was booking a flight online, a business trip, and I was in the airline website, and right at the end of the process, where I was checking out to pay for my ticket, I see this prompt by the airline website telling me if I want to pay to offset the carbon footprint of my flight. What's this? What is carbon offsetting? So why should I do this? I just kept thinking, and carbon footprint reduction is on the agenda of many companies, but more often than not, they are unsure where to start. And our guest today has one option. So who are you and what do you do?
Hi everyone, my name is Nicklas Kaskeala. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Compensate. And Compensate is a Finnish carbon offset service provider like we just was mentioned. We work in the voluntary carbon market where especially companies are taking responsibility for those emissions that they cannot completely avoid or minimize.
So there's
yet.
So much conversation around carbon emissions,
over 3 years,
carbon footprint reduction, and as I said, more often than not, the people get lost in these technicalities. They may not understand fully the science behind it or what is behind all these things. So Nicklas, what exactly is carbon offsetting?
Yes. So carbon offsetting is a way to take responsibility for those emissions that you can't completely avoid or minimize yet. Obviously, the number one solution to the climate crisis is to decarbonize and radically reduce emissions. We need to reach almost zero emissions as soon as possible. But every day, you and I, all companies around the world are still causing greenhouse gas emissions. So carbon offsetting is a way to take responsibility, try to counterbalance those emissions by supporting projects that either sequester or remove carbon from the atmosphere or maybe support emission reductions in some other way. And these are activities that happen outside the value chain of companies. So it's kind of a service that you can purchase from different actors it's like a cleaning service. When you cause a mess by emitting greenhouse gases and you contribute to the climate crisis in a negative way, this is a way to try to counterbalance that negative impact that especially companies, but why not individual consumers as well, have. It's a very small market still, but it's growing very fast at the moment because especially companies who are setting climate targets like carbon neutrality or net zero realize that they will not reach these targets only by emission reductions, even though that's always the primary way to try to reach these targets. There will still remain some emissions that they need to counterbalance in some way or the other. So basically, I think in this point of the climate crisis, we have reached a point where emission reductions alone are not enough. We also need to take responsibility for those emissions that we're causing today, tomorrow, the year after, while we try to decarbonize radically.
So if I try to unpack a bit this, so we are any given company that has a production activity, an industrial production, or anyway, any type of economical activity, as long as you produce something and you use, a truck or something to transport that good, that product somewhere else. So all those activities are the ones that, of course, are creating, are sending emissions to the atmosphere because, that's how the production works. So we are, as a company or any given company, is releasing this carbon, producing these emissions, And as much as the companies want, they want to use green energy or green electricity. They want to use not for transportation, not fuel or fossil fuel trucks, but electric trucks, perhaps. So that is all good. But what I am understanding here is that may be not enough. There's still some emissions, some carbon footprint from that company that, well, I don't know if at some point they may arrive to the ideal net zero. But if not, then that's when the carbon offsetting comes into place. Somewhere in some other part of the city, the country, or the world, may be a project or an initiative that is trying to reduce or compensate. There you go, compensate those carbon emissions. So is that, if I cannot reduce on one side, and my company cannot reduce my carbon emissions, then I can do that by pairing or by working together this other initiative, project, NGO, or I don't know. That's how it works, correct? That it just to balance both things.
Yes, although I would emphasize still that it's not a substitute for emission reductions. It's something that you do beyond emission reductions. All companies should try to align their emission reductions according to climate science and the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. Then offsetting is a way of going beyond that. It's a way of taking responsibility for those emissions that you're still causing in the near future. And in the future, or even reaching net zero or carbon neutrality will not be enough. We will need to be carbon negative quite soon as well. So we need to remove a lot of excess carbon from the atmosphere. And offsetting, or the voluntary carbon market, is a way of doing that. If I give you an example of how to frame the situation where we are now. Imagine the Earth's atmosphere as a bathtub, and the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are the water running into that bathtub. Now, we have had the tap on in that bathtub. The water has been running for centuries and decades, resulting in a situation where the water level is already dangerously high, or it's actually overflowing, going above the limits of that bathtub. The same thing with the atmosphere. We have surpassed safe levels of greenhouse gases, of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, already back in 1987. So that's quite a long time ago, and we're still adding every single day more carbon dioxide and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And emission reductions is basically you turning the tap a bit down the tap a bit, but the water is still running. What we would need to turn the tap and close it completely, but that's impossible in today's society. So we also need to take out the drain out the excess water by taking the plug out from the bottom, and that is what carbon offsetting, when it's done properly, can do. Is that you can also try to sort of remove some of that excess carbon dioxide that we have already added to the atmosphere and that we're adding every day, while at the same time we try to reduce those emissions. So it's a way of, like, a more holistic way of taking responsibility for the climate damage that we're all causing right now. So in a way, I would really want to emphasize that it's never a substitute for closing that tap or reducing emissions. It's something that we have to do in addition to that.
So as you said, it's not a substitute. The companies are good to go with all their carbon footprint reduction programs, whether they will eventually really get to zero or negative or not. But it's a matter of time, which we do not have time. This time is, or the clock is ticking, and in order to speed up, or in order to recompensate all this process that we humans provoked, or as you mentioned already, we arrived to the tipping point already many years ago. This releasing the tap from the other side of the bath tube. So that would be one of the most efficient things to do, to release. And then how does that unplugging or releasing that tap from the other side, which are these other projects, companies, NGOs, or how does that work? That unplugging or pulling the plug in the other side of the bath tube.
Yeah, So there are thousands of projects around the world that produce what are called carbon credits that can be bought by these companies who want to offset their emissions, or also individuals, like you mentioned, the flight compensation in the beginning of the podcast. Although I have to say that most airlines, the way they provide these services, it's pure greenwashing, because they don't calculate most of the emissions of flying, or they exclude them, and also the actual offsets that they use are very flawed, and it's pure greenwashing in most cases. But anyway, the mechanism is such that you have projects around the world that create these carbon credits by, for example, sequestering or removing carbon from the atmosphere by afforestation or reforestation, protecting mangroves, even blue carbon projects that are using growing kelp to sequester carbon, etc. There are different ways. There are these nature-based solutions, like I just mentioned. Also, some engineered approaches like direct air capture with machines, or technology, direct air capture of carbon and storing it. So these projects create these carbon credits that then can be sold to companies. And when these carbon credits are retired, that means the company that has bought them claims that, hey, we have counterbalanced our emissions by using these carbon credits. So in theory, very simple.
So that's how the payment goes. Or ideally, from one side, since I'm not able to reduce this amount of carbon footprint, so I paid, and that money, that's how the payment goes or works. That payment goes to the other side to finance or to help these projects. And that's how, however, the credits are calculated. But that's how the payment actually works, or the money matter works, to finance those projects.
Well, not really finance. It's more like they buy a certificate from these projects, a carbon credit that is proof of a certain climate impact that project has had. So it's what we call ex post. So it means that the climate impact of that project has already taken place, and they have been able to prove that, and it has been audited and verified by independent third parties, and then they have produced this carbon credit that then can be bought by the company.
How are these carbon credits calculated? How do you have any example of? And actually, because in the example that I put, that it's a real thing, that when I was booking my flight, actually the airline was offering you which project, there you go, do you want to help or to support with your payment. And it was this village in India, in rural India, where they are promoting the use of natural gas instead of burning coal for cooking in the village, in the houses. So they support the use of natural gas. At least in theory, that was the project where, well, my money should go to offset. But on that side, how these credits are calculated, how you come up with these credits and the value they have in money.
Well, first of all, I think they're using biogas, natural gas.
Biogas, sure, yes.
The term used for fossil gas, even though it's very misleading.
Yes, sorry, yes.
I know this project type, and it's actually extremely problematic as a project that creates carbon offset credits. But let me give you a more simple example, and maybe we can get back to why these biogas projects are problematic. A simple example is, for example, the reforestation of degraded lands, where a project plants trees that sequester and store carbon. And after the trees have grown a certain amount, through different methodologies, we can calculate how much carbon they have sequestered and stored. And thus, independent third party comes to the project and verifies that there are a certain amount of trees, and with certain like carbon curve factors, we can determine how much the climate impact of that is. And this project can create these carbon credits. It sounds very simple, but in reality, it's much, much more complex. And the sort of main quality characteristic of a good carbon offset project is that it's additional, which means that it wouldn't have taken place in like as business as usual. The the purchase or the purchase of the carbon credit really has to impact that project. So it shouldn't have taken place in any way because of like policies that are in place in that country, or that because it's economically viable already, or it's a good business case. Like there are projects around the world that create carbon credits from supporting renewable energy, for example. But renewable energy is already it's already extremely competitive, and most countries in the world, it's more competitive than fossil energy. So creating carbon credits from such projects is not additional, because these projects would take place anyway, even without selling these carbon credits. It's just a way of making them perhaps even more profitable than they were earlier. These projects might have been additional 10, 15 years ago, but not anymore today. So as a buyer of these carbon credits, you need to be very vigilant to understand that a lot of the credits available on this voluntary carbon market are in fact not creating any additional or real climate impact that wouldn't happen anyway.
So maybe that's where the perception, because I'm realizing that is maybe just a perception game of the greenwashing. Okay, one element is pay. I mean, using money is like just to keep my conscience, my soul in peace, because I pay and I'm happy with that. That's one element which may be misunderstood. But then when you mention in the other side, those projects that are not really, I mean, with the math, they are not really helping. As you said, they will have already anyway, with my payment or not, or with the money of whoever is paying, they will anyway keep carrying on, and not really offsetting anything to the atmosphere. So this is the game, or how do you interpret this greenwashing perception? Because that's what I'm thinking is very easily perceived as greenwashing, or blaming you, I don't know, someone that doesn't understand exactly how this works. They may immediately point you like, no, this is greenwashing. So how you deal with this kind of pushback or this rhetoric?
I agree with most of it, because that's the case. When it comes to the projects, Compensate has evaluated. We have created our own criteria to evaluate these projects that create carbon credits, and we've done this together with the scientific community and with some top climate and forest scientists, for example. And there are some, voluntary standards that certify these projects, but we don't think they do a good enough job. So that's why we wanted to work with the scientific community to go beyond them. And we have, in the past 2.5 years, evaluated now over 170 of the top tier projects around the world, and less than 10% of them pass our due diligence or our evaluation process. So that says a lot about the quality on the market. But at the same time, there are good projects, and this pressure and maybe some media attention that's been put on the market. And for example, we do a lot of advocacy work to improve the standards on the market. I think we're moving forward. So I wouldn't say that the criticism should result in abandoning this mechanism, but rather we should take this criticism seriously. Mm-hmm. And work towards improving the market, because there is no way we will reach our climate targets if we don't do two things at the same time: radically reduce emissions, but also take responsibility for those emissions we're still causing in the near future. And at some point, taking responsibility for historic emissions as well, by going towards carbon negativity and actually removing more carbon from the atmosphere than we add to it. So we need this market, we need this mechanism. It's just that the current market has some severe flaws, and it's quite difficult for companies or individuals to navigate and try to understand what are the good projects and what are the bad projects. And this is why we do a lot of work with media, with publishing reports and white papers, trying to educate also the buyers of these credits that you need to be vigilant and understand the complexities of the market, and not maybe trust existing standards, but sort of dig deeper to understand what these projects actually do and what they don't.
So how should we evaluate? I mean, if it is a person from a company, they may not be certainly an expert on this, but hey, somebody's offering me offering me this project to offset. But as you said, out of 170 projects that you have evaluated, less than 10% actually are at standard, are good. So how do I know if I am falling, if the project that is presented to me is one of those 10%, or maybe it's the remaining 90% that who knows how they do it, or who knows if they are real? I don't know if there's also a trust element. How do you evaluate that project is actually, and if you want to dig into technicalities, that's okay. So how do we evaluate these projects?
Well, I would say if you don't have the expertise in-house as a company, you need to find a trusted partner who you can do that with. And obviously Compensate, I hope, is one of those trusted partners. I would say that if you basic rules is not to trust existing standards as a guarantee of quality. They might be a good starting point. There are some voluntary standards on the market like Verra and Gold Standard, etc., that maybe provide the tools to dig deeper into the projects. They provide a lot of documentation and registries of the projects. But you need to find a part, if you don't have the in-house expertise to evaluate the projects deeper, find a partner that has that expertise and that you can trust, and a partner that's communicates openly the risks involved in this, and also understands and doesn't sort of hide behind existing standards and say that, hey, everything's fine, when it actually is not. So I think transparency and honesty from the partner in that sense will enable that trust. And that's exactly what we're trying to communicate. We're not saying that this is a bulletproof solution. There are many flaws on the market, but if you do things right, you can still create real climate impact. I mean, there's no point in doing offsetting wrong. There's just no point. You're not actually, you're just removing carbon or creating climate impact on paper, but in reality, it's not doing anything. So for some companies, it might be like offsetting is like a tick in the box exercise that, hey, we have bought these credits and we're now fine. But in reality, there's no climate impact. So that's why if you're really driven by creating climate impact, you shouldn't treat this as a tick in the box exercise.
Yeah, what I was saying exactly at the beginning is just for my own peace of mind. We tick the box, we did it, we paid, and we forget about the thing, and thank you, bye-bye. And why in the other side, yeah, you may have paid, but that is pretty much wasted. Is not really making a true impact, because what you said, all these projects may not be fully compliant. You mentioned some voluntary standards. I also found out something at the gold standard or gold seal, something like that. But those are voluntary, you mentioned. What does that mean, or why cannot, or who should make them mandatory? Is there any authority of any sort?
Yeah, this is still a very lightly or non-regulated market. So to kind of, because there is very little regulation, then these voluntary standards have kind of tried to be some kind of assurance of quality. You mentioned Gold Standard, that's the second biggest, and Verra is the biggest on the market, but there are like probably a dozen others, smaller standards as well. So what they do is audit these projects and create make sure that the methodologies are, in their opinion, solid and so forth. But they're a good starting point, and for us, they provide, for example, lots of documentation that we can review when we evaluate these projects. But there are still, they are not an assurance of quality. Like we've seen that less than 10% of these projects are good enough for us. So, yeah, there is regulation now coming. For example, just this week, the EU is introducing carbon removal certificates. There is EU is also introducing a green claims initiative or directive where companies are should be more transparent and accountable about the climate claims that they make. There are various international initiatives, one in the Nordics creating the guidelines for best practices. There's an international initiative called the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market that is trying to create what are called the core carbon principles, which would be like a overarching principle for good quality carbon credits. So there's a lot of things going on, and many of these are sort of soft law approaches that hopefully then at some point also become more like real laws in the EU and member states and around the world. So I think there's an acknowledgement that we need we need to regulate this market better because there's so much greenwashing going on. But maybe the regulators and politicians haven't yet realized how big this market might grow and how fastly we need to move ahead with that necessary regulation. This is something that we advocate for, and we work constantly with decision makers trying to open their eyes and make sure that they understand that, hey, they need to take more a proactive approach in regulating this market.
Which is this Nordic certificate that you mentioned? Which is the name of it?
So this Nordic Council of Ministers has actually yesterday released the final report on the Nordic guidelines for best practices of the use of voluntary carbon offsetting, and it defines a lot of like key elements that make sure that companies can then it's like a checklist for companies also to make sure that when they venture into this market, they need to make sure that the credits that they buy comply with these best practices. And it also gives guidance on how to communicate things properly and transparently, and how to get the claims like carbon neutrality, net zero, offsetting, how to get these claims right, because it's not just word, like semantics, it actually matters what claims you make because they need to be, truthful. So it's a very good and welcome initiative for the Nordics at least, and I hope it also impacts the wider market more broadly.
So how much of we want the politicians to be involved with this? To some extent, of course, yes, because if they are the ones driving the legislative agenda, or that we will have a legal framework to follow. But how much is sometimes driven by the opportunity by the politicians? I was following, I'm sure, I guess you were following also what happened in Sharm el-Sheikh recently in the COP27. That was, to my understanding, there was some projects or some initiative driven by politicians that was similar to this. We have these projects with these initiatives that if you fund them, they will help you to offset your carbon footprint. But I don't know if you follow what they were saying, but that was kind of a big deal that was announced in COP27.
Yeah, I was there at COP27.
There you go.
So this is now what the Paris Agreement and the whole COP mechanism, the UNFCCC, has only jurisdiction of so-called compliance carbon markets. So carbon trading between countries, basically, or through a mechanism where countries can buy carbon credits in order to sort of offset their own national emissions. And so this, under the Paris Agreement, we have a thing called the Article 6, which sort of establishes the rules for this compliance carbon trading or this compliance carbon market. But that's a different market from the market where companies operate. So companies operate in the voluntary carbon market because they have no compliance needs to offset their emissions. They do it purely on a voluntary basis to reach their climate targets that they've set out, like carbon neutrality or net zero or some other targets that they may have. So they need to use these carbon credits in order to take responsibility for their emissions. But it's a separate market from what has been negotiated and agreed upon in COP26 and 27. In COP26 in Glasgow, I was there as well. The kind of finally the sort of ground rules for this compliance market was created, and now in Egypt in COP27, some of the details were agreed upon, but a lot of things were pushed to COP28 next year as well, because there was disagreement on many of the more like technical issues. So these two things are slightly separate, but there is also obviously the voluntary market will, if the rules and regulations around the compliance market are very robust and strong, they will obviously impact also the voluntary market. So that's why organizations like Compensate try to be at these COPs try to influence the decision makers there so that we get very good and robust rules for the compliance markets, because then we can say that, okay, if these are the rules for international compliance carbon market, we should also apply them for the voluntary market. So that's why it's important to be there as well and try to impact these negotiations.
All right. So talk about a bit the type of projects that you have been, actually a couple of things that would be interesting to dig deeper. The type of projects that you have evaluated and they do comply with all the quality and with all the certifications. And on the other side, what type of customers, or industries you are or are more interested in this carbon offsetting? So first, the projects. Which type of projects are you considering that are good to invest in?
Yes, so we focus on what are called nature-based solutions. So basically using the power of nature, photosynthesis, and the power of biomass to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, and the ability it has to store that carbon if taken care of properly. There are all the other approaches also, like more engineered approaches, but they are still in, I would say, very early phases and not scalable yet. So there is a lot of development going on into, for example, direct air capture with machines or other ways of capturing carbon, but they are still so small scale that they are not maybe the solution for today, but maybe in the 30s or 40s, hopefully they will have scales. But with the urgency of the climate crisis, we need to make use of those mechanisms that we can scale already today. So we focus a lot on these nature-based carbon removal projects, which could be afforestation or reforestation or restoring mangroves, for example, but also some more innovative solutions like growing kelp and sequestering a lot of carbon and then letting that kelp then sink to the bottom of the ocean where it's stored for a long time. So even in this nature-based space, there are some innovative solutions going on. And then one solution that we're very fond of and have been using for a long time already is biochar, which is kind of in the middle of these engineered solutions and nature-based solutions, where we can use waste biomass, for example, from waste streams of different production, and pyrolyze that into biochar, which is a product that stores the carbon for a long, long time, even hundreds of years potentially. And that product can also be used in many ways that are beneficial to the environment, for enriching soils, for example, or other cases where it has like benefits even beyond the storage of the carbon. So this is our focus area, because we think that these solutions that nature kind of offers us are the ones that should be scaled and can be scaled today. And what's really nice about these solutions often is that they also help us tackle the other huge crisis that we're facing, which is the loss of biodiversity. So we are in essence letting nature be nature and giving value to that by producing carbon credits from, it, so that it becomes, for example, more profitable to restore nature than to destroy it, by creating value for that like service that the nature provides by sequestering and storing carbon, but also by more and more because of biodiversity issues and the way it preserves biodiversity or counters nature loss.
So where are all these, geographically in the world, where are they located? Because you talk about biodiversity, of course, that, I don't know, that immediately brings me the image of the Amazon forest, I don't know, or Southeast Asia jungle, or where are these projects and how do we ensure that, well, they keep, not just they keep up to the standard, but they continue, they have consistency and they don't drop the quality. So where they are, how do we ensure, is there any mechanism to ensure that they keep, well, doing what they are saying they're doing?
Yeah. So in terms of the atmosphere, it doesn't matter where the projects are, because the atmosphere is, we only have one atmosphere. And in terms of creating climate impact, you want to create the climate impact where it's most cost effective, right? So quite often these projects, like for historical reasons, are in the global south, where it might be more cost effective to take some of these measures. However, there is a certain element of what is called like carbon colonialism there, where because these projects and carbon offsets are often bought by companies or individuals in the global north, so the wealthy people of the world. So we need to be very aware of that framing as well, so that it doesn't become a system where we just keep polluting and then we just buy these credits in order to, clean up after ourselves, while we don't really work towards decarbonizing. So that's again one reason why it's so essential to always prioritize emission reductions. Offsetting is never the number one solution. It's like you can see it as one tool in the toolbox. If you have a construction project, you're using tens or hundreds of tools to build your construction or your project. And then at the end of the project, you take out one tool to finish everything off. And that's the way I see offsetting. It's just one tool, but it's an essential tool to finish the project. But before that, you need every other thing in order to do that. So that's the same thing with emission reductions in comparison to the offsetting. But at the same time, good carbon projects actually support local communities, give them, for example, livelihoods that are more sustainable. They help many of these countries in the global south protect the biodiversity that is very valuable for them in many ways. So I think by designing good projects and finding good projects, we can tackle this sort of carbon colonialism criticism. But I would hope that more and more projects are developed also in the global north, so that we can kind of use local projects as well. But there are some legislative issues, especially in Europe and North America, that prevent this happening at the moment at large scale. But yeah, that's the geography is basically can be all over the world. We have projects at the moment in Latin America, in Africa, in Zambia, for example, in Tanzania, Kenya. We have projects in Asia, in Myanmar, Indonesia, etc. Some of the more sort of engineered projects that we have in our portfolio are in Europe, these biochar projects, because there is perhaps more sort of innovation around them in Europe. But yeah, I mean, essentially these projects could be anywhere in the world, but from a cost effectiveness perspective, it makes sense to do it where you get most impact per invested euro. And that's why many of the projects have been designed and created in the global south.
All right. So, okay, now in the other side, what you are calling the global north of, the companies using this carbon offset, or the industries, which industries or which type of company you see that is most interested at the moment, and which company should be, maybe they are not now, but should be more interested in your view?
Yeah. It's actually a very, very global market right now, where I don't really see like some industries doing more than others, because it's like pretty much all industries are waking up to this problem that they need to reach carbon neutrality or net zero quite soon, and they don't have the means to do that exclusively by reducing emissions. So they need to rely on these carbon markets and offsetting. Lately, we've seen a lot of interest, especially in like the construction industry, because there are some hard to abate emissions in that sector. Traditionally, we've seen airlines use carbon offsets, but again, there are very many issues there where we see most airline services as faulty. One of the reasons is that they don't honestly calculate the climate impact of flying. They only usually use direct CO2 emissions, and they exclude the sort of non-CO2 impact of flying, which can be 3 times as big as just the CO2 emissions. So basically, the thing you mentioned in the beginning, that you were offered a service, probably the emissions of that calculation that was made on the website was roughly 1/3 of the true climate impact of flying. So that's, first of all, very dishonest, and it's essentially greenwashing. And even if you were to offset those emissions with the proper carbon credit, you wouldn't have offset all emissions. You would have only offset a very small fraction of that. So there's a lot of things that need to be done on that side of things, sort of calculating and establishing that the emission calculations have been done properly. But there I see less of the airline industry is a very specific example of that. And I think in other industries, we are much more precise on the emission calculation side of things. But there are certain industries that are like hard to abate, where it's very difficult to decarbonize in the near future. So they perhaps might see that this is an attractive way to take responsibility. But at the same time, then there are other companies who have the financial means to do this, like big tech companies who might not have a huge carbon footprint compared to manufacturing industries, for example, but they have the financial resources to do this. So we're also seeing many of them being quite active and sort of saying that, hey, we want to be front runners here and show that we can do this. So yeah, it's difficult to pinpoint a certain industry where this is more popular than others, because I see this happening pretty much all over the place. But what has changed in recent years, that like maybe 3-4 years ago, quite often offsetting was seen as something that consumers do. But now it has shifted almost completely, so that companies are the ones that take responsibility and don't give that, or sort of don't shift that responsibility towards the consumers. It's more the companies who want to do this themselves, rather than providing a service like you were provided when you booked your flight. So that's changing, I think, quite dramatically right now.
One key element that I'm realizing here is how do we communicate all these processes, and of course the transparency that should be in that communication. So that was something that you were referring before. So the way you research projects, evaluate, and report on them. So transparency is one key thing, but also for the companies purchasing these credits, how would you advise to then communicate over that? Okay, be clear which elements these companies can have to show the proof. Hey, this is it, black and white. I am doing the things in the right way.
Yeah, I think, you need to start with transparency about the emissions, first of all, and how they have been calculated and determined. So especially if you're not offsetting all emissions, that should be communicated transparently. So quite often what I see is companies saying that they are carbon neutral or that they have offset their emissions, but it's actually, they refer only to their direct emissions, so what are called scopes 1 and 2, and they exclude value chain emissions, which is called scope 3 under the greenhouse gas protocol. And scope 3, the value chain emissions, usually in most companies' cases is where the large majority of their emissions lie. Obviously there is some overlap in the scope 3, because someone's scope 3 is always someone else's scope 1 and 2. But still, I think even if you are just offsetting or claiming carbon neutrality, for example, for your direct emission scopes 1 and 2, you should communicate that clearly, so that, for example, as a consumer, if you walk into a supermarket and it says that we're carbon neutral, that consumer should understand it doesn't apply to the goods that are sold in that supermarket, only towards the direct emissions of that market, like the purchased energy they purchase and the direct emissions that they cause. So this has to be very, very, very careful. So you can't use these like claims or labels to confuse stakeholders or consumers. I think that's number one. Then when it comes to the other side of things, what type of projects are being used, I think, we need more transparency on that side as well. At least for those stakeholders and consumers who want to dig in deeper. Obviously, not everyone has the capability, maybe, or the willingness to do that. And they might kind of just trust some kind of standard or stamp. But for those who want to dig deeper, for those stakeholders, you need to be able to provide that extra link where you can read more or have that information at hand if someone requests it. But again, I think here it's, I think most of the buying companies have acted in good faith when they have bought some of these credits that have been verified by some of the leading voluntary standards. They have not necessarily understood that they should, dig in deeper. So it's also the responsibility of the sellers of these carbon credits like organizations like Compensate and our peers to be honest and not sell bad quality stuff. We can't completely rely on voluntary actions here. That's why we need the politicians to step in and also regulate this market so that we can wash out some of the pure greenwashing that's going on and sort of make sure that everybody has a level playing field. But before we reach that, it's up to the market actors themselves to create this transparency, to create this trust in the market. And I think, there it's you need to just have high integrity and understand that climate impact is always what we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah, at the end of the day, integrity, transparency, commitment is, from both sides, government and or governmental entities and the private sector, that they really want to make this happen. Something that caught my attention from Compensate is Compensate Foundation. What is that? What is the Compensate Foundation?
Yes, so we have, in essence, two entities in the Compensate group. We have a Compensate Ltd, a company that provides the offsetting services to other companies, for example, advisory on those things, etc. But the foundation is a non-profit entity, and it works on advocacy to improve the entire voluntary carbon market. So basically what we're trying to do is advocate for that necessary regulation, make sure that we put pressure on existing standards to improve. We write white papers, go to these COP climate meetings, take part in different industry and stakeholder consultations so that we try to improve the whole integrity of the market. So I think with Compensate, we're not just we don't want to limit our impact on creating a service that we think is high integrity and that allows companies to actually use this market already today. But we also want to push the entire market forward. And that's why we have this kind of non-profit arm of our organization where we actively do that. And I think we've been able to reach some sort of thought leadership in this market already. We've been highlighted in many important medias like Financial Times, Bloomberg, Nikkei in Japan, etc., that have sort of written about our reports and our white papers and said that, hey, there's this organization in Finland that says only 10% of these projects are good. And then that media attention obviously then also puts pressure on market actors to improve. So that's something that we constantly do.
Yeah, that's something, as you said, something that we need all to collaborate to raise the bar, to raise the awareness of this is one option that is very valid, that you as production company or manufacturing or any type of for-profit organization can use, and which at the end of the day, yes, it's for the benefit of our own Earth, of our own planet. So this has been super, super interesting, Nicklas. So in your view, who should we interview next in this podcast that we can dig deeper or widen this topic about carbon offsetting, or actually doing any other initiative for the good of our planet? Who should we interview?
I think one of the things that's been most impactful in the climate movement or sort of the raising climate awareness in recent years has been the youth climate movement. The fact that young people are demanding that we, the older generations, actually take responsibility for the mess that we have caused. I don't want to name any names here, but I think it would be great if you give that voice also to the younger generations that are, it's about their future, about the future of their future children, etc. And they have so much more at stake here. Obviously, myself as a parent, I have a lot at stake as well when I think about the future world that my children will be living in, and perhaps their children. So it's very personal, I think, for anyone who's a parent. But I think when that message comes from our own children, it strikes close to home. And I think that's why I really I don't want to it's our responsibility to clean up after us. We shouldn't put that responsibility on our children. But what we can do is give them a voice and listen to them so that we actually wake up and understand that, hey, we've caused this mess. It's our duty to clean up after ourselves as well.
Curiously enough, this is already the second time that we are hearing this in our podcast. Children are teaching us many things. Let's come back and listen to them, because they may have a very different perception of this world, but precisely because of that, they have very good, different ideas, a different perspective. So, Nicklas, thank you very much for your time today. Please let our audience know where they can connect with you, where they can go to learn more about Compensate.
Yes. So, obviously, easiest way is to go to our website, compensate.com, and learn more from there. And you can find our contact details, social media, etc. there. And if you're really interested in learning taking a deep dive, please have a look at our white papers about the voluntary carbon market and how we think it should be reformed. But thank you also for inviting me to this podcast. It was a pleasure to be here, and I hope the listeners also enjoyed this. So thank you on my behalf as well.
Definitely, we will put some links to your website and to all those white papers in the show notes of this episode, so people can just click there and go and learn more about Compensate, yes, but about carbon offsetting and which are the possibilities there. So other than that, thank you so much, Urbanistas, for listening today, and see you the next time.
Thank you for listening to the Urbanista podcast, a production of Uponor Infra, the leader in sustainable infrastructure solutions. If you found it interesting, why don't you share it with your colleagues? We all together can move our industry forward.